Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our panel discussion, Reclaiming Our Space, Design, Community, and Co-Creation. It almost goes without saying that over the last year, global events have caused us to re-examine our relationship to place. While COVID has forced us to consider the value of good public spaces, social movements have asked us to critically examine who had access to these spaces to begin with. In the face of such seismic shifts in our understanding of the human connection to place, inclusivity might just be the guiding principle by which we can reclaim and re-energize our spaces. While the desire for inclusive, welcoming spaces where people feel like they belong is all well and good, how do we actually create such environments? What shifts in our thinking are required to create inclusion? And what value does such design thinking create? While we hope to answer some of these questions today, I'm sure that our discussion will bring up as many questions as answers. So for that reason, the last 15 minutes of today's discussion will be reserved for audience questions. If you have any questions, please submit them using the SurveyMonkey link provided. In addition, if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to contact Christina at Entro.com. Okay, now to introduce our wonderful panel for today. Dr. Julie Nagam is a Canadian Research Chair in Indigenous Arts, Collaboration, and Digital Media, and is an Associate Professor in the Department of Art History at the University of Winnipeg. She is the inaugural Artistic Director of the 2020-21 for Nuit Blanche Toronto, the largest public exhibition in North America. She is a collective member of GLAM, which works on cultural activism, Indigenous methodologies, public art, digital technologies, and engagement with place. As a scholar and artist, she is interested in revealing the ontology of land, which contains memory, knowledge, and living histories. Her artistic work has been exhibited internationally, including in Brazil, France, New Zealand, and England. Dr. Nagam is the director of the Abidjibawan New Media Lab and co-director of the Kashedagay Collaborative Research Center in Winnipeg, Canada. Hi, Dr. Nagam. Nice of you to join us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Super happy to be here.
Of course, looking forward to our chat today. Gila Omar Kyle is Vice President, Social Impact at Daniels Corporation, a leading Greater Toronto area-based builder developer. She is responsible for strategic initiatives that look to ensure that the social, cultural, and economic infrastructure of communities built by Daniels are as strong as the new buildings. Since 2009, Gila has been working on the revitalization of Regent Park in Toronto's downtown east. The revitalization of the 69-acre social housing neighborhood to a mixed income and mixed use community is looked to around the world as a model for creating healthy, inclusive, and resilient communities. Hello, Gila.
Hi, Bertrand. Looking forward to the discussion.
As am I. Next, we have Philip Demers. He is a Montreal entrepreneur who in 2009 founded Massive Art, where he is now the global creative director. Massive Art is a global art consultancy and production agency collaborating with emerging and established artists, architects, and developers and creative talent to create architectural design, commissioned works of art, and cultural programs. Philip has received several nominations and mentions as a creative entrepreneur, the latest being CodaWorks, who selected him as one of the 25 creative revolutionaries who are leading the way to positive change. I'm looking forward to what this positive change might look like, Philip.
Thanks, everyone. Same here. Glad to be on the panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Prue Roby has built her reputation over 3 decades as an arts executive, trusted advisor to the public, private, and nonprofit sectors in Canada and the UK, as a passionate advocate for the transformative impact of the arts on people and communities. The centerpiece of Prue's consulting practice is the development of innovative, multi-sector approaches to support arts and cultural sector development, creative economy, activation, and inclusive creative placemaking. Previously Vice President at Artscape in Toronto, Prue led the research and development, program design, and stakeholder engagement for major new arts facilities, including Daniels Spectrum, Artscape Daniels Launchpad, and Artscape Weston Hub. Good afternoon, Prue.
Hi there, looking forward to this. Thanks for inviting me to join this conversation.
Of course. And finally, as workplace strategist, designer, and project leader at Alliance Architects, Rochelle Marish thrives on working closely with clients to advance business goals, foster employee engagement, stimulate innovation, and promote organizational wellness. Her research and planning recognize the diversity of work styles that both accelerate client innovation and inspire customer confidence. Passionate about employee well-being and wellness, Rochelle helps organizations create livable, healthy work environments through an inclusive and interactive design process. And I'm looking forward to discussing what this design process looks like today, Rochelle.
Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to our discussion as well today.
Wonderful. All right, now that we got introductions out of the way, let's jump into why we're all here. So why the concept of inclusive design is far from new. We've recently seen a greater focus or spotlight on this concept of inclusivity and inclusive spaces. At our work at Entro, more and more we're seeing proposals and projects come in where inclusivity is positioned as one of the primary principles of the project. So Gila, I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to this renewed interest in inclusive design and how this idea of inclusivity might have changed or evolved the last little while.
Thanks, Vidren. Happy to jump right in. I would say what I'm sort of noticing and what we're noticing at Daniels is really that inclusivity won't happen by accident. It won't sort of be a byproduct of the design process, and it really needs intentionality. And what we've been focused on is, what are the factors or those organizing elements that can help facilitate inclusion. We've really looked at sort of things that we've started identifying 3 organizing elements: arts and culture, food and urban agriculture, and sports and physical activity as really tools to incorporate in the design of both places and programs that help people come together to create those connections regardless of sort of cultural, language, racial, socioeconomic backgrounds. That's really been the focus. The other thing that we've been looking at is very much, where in the process does inclusion actually happen? We've been really good at sort of inclusion through programming and, after a design process, but how do you actually get a diverse range of voices at the table through the design process? So really taking that step back to say, when we're designing, how do we have voices at the table, recognizing that expertise is not just in sort of formal or professional training, but really comes from lived experiences. And as we continue the discussion, something I'd put to my fellow panelists to sort of think about and comment on is, how should we be designing? Do we go to that concept of designing for the masses, assuming that the masses are representative and inclusive? Or do we start designing for specific interest groups and making sure that we're creating spaces where they're sort of safe and accessible for different populations?
It's a good point. I wonder if anybody would like to field this question or this statement that Gila just mentioned there. Who are we designing for the masses or individual groups and individual communities? How can we think about this tension between these two potential approaches?
I wouldn't mind just going back to the other question of where in the process does inclusion actually happen, because I think that that's actually the nugget of all the pieces that you were saying. And I think from when I think about, when I'm being asked to be a diverse voice at the table, or where that process is happening, that's really important to me. So, if I'm coming in or somebody's asking me once the project's already been designed and the ideas are already out there, and then they're like, oh, could you just add this small little bit about your specific area of interest? I'm 100% not doing that. And I think that what has happened in the past, and even still now, there's all of a sudden the realization of like, oh my God, I realize we've done this entire project and the culture of people that we've been working with is monolithic. And so whatever that demographic looks like, it's like, oh, all of a sudden we have this kind of epiphany that we need to do that. And then, I get the rushed emails of like, dear Dr. Nagam, could you please assist us on this architectural project or this piece over here? And I think that, for me, when I'm a reviewer or a person that's actually going to add my contribution, for me, it has to be BIPOC leadership or in collaboration. And I think that even you're posing your question of co-creation, I think is so critical for us to kind of move forward. And that's how those bodies, just how whether they're the masses or the smaller groups, people are inclined to want to come into those spaces almost automatically because they know and see visual markers and ways of being, or embodied knowledge that brings them to those specific spaces. So I think for me, the biggest thing that you're saying is like, whether you're on the review team, whether you're on the planning team and the design team or the implementation team, where was inclusion actually brought into the conversation? And was it an afterthought? Was it right from creation or birth of the idea? Same thing, I've been asked to being brought into projects well after everything else is done. And it's like, we have lots of contributions, and there's lots of us across Canada and globally that have expertise in these areas. And I think that you have to make distinctive decisions of making sure that those voices are at the table, and they have to be deliberate, because they don't just happen by accident, as we've seen in the last 20 years, even the last 5 years. It's not a coincidence, or it's not a thing that just kind of magically happens. It is a deliberate decision, just like a designated hire. Like there has to be that kind of desire from your team to make sure that happens, and what that looks like, I think it's all up in the air still.
Yeah,
I think it's really.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, this is the Zoom challenge, isn't it? I have to say, what I have been thinking a lot about in recent times, certainly heightened in what has happened in the last year or so, is sort of moving on from the sort of incremental approach to how we engage diverse communities in this work in a meaningful way. And there's no question that the kinds of practices and tools and tactics that we have to do that have expanded, substantially in recent years, towards thinking about what sort of systems change we need to be thinking about. I heard this expression recently. It's bouncing around the internet, and it's new to me. It may well not be new to anyone else. Racism is not the shark, and it's the water we swim in. And I think that really summed up my sense that we need to be moving into that place of thinking about systems. And to be honest, in many of our communities, if we're going to do that, actually, one of the first things we have to think about is, if we really meaningfully want to properly, inclusively engage people in imagining the future of their communities, they need to have a real meaningful stake in the future of those communities. And that actually is fundamentals like affordable housing. It's fundamentals about thinking about really what do we mean by safe places? Really, what do we mean by that? So I think there are some sort of fundamentals in there. I think there are other things we can think about. Who gets to be an architect or a designer, right? Who gets to, that's pretty important. Who feels comfortable participating in the kinds of lead community organizations that often represent communities in these processes? Who actually participates in residents' associations or business improvement areas, those kinds of formal structures? What do we need to do about those? What do planning systems do? What might they do to raise the bar about the expectations they place on developers for this kind of work, beyond the sort of kind of formal public consultation agonies that many of us have participated in over the years? Absolutely, Julia. How can we actually accelerate community-led and especially BIPOC-led stewardship, governance, ownership of public places and spaces? And, in the development industry, as Gila's pointing to, really, how do we blow air into the development process to create the room that's needed for the kind of deep, rich, from the ground up, from the beginning processes that I think Julie's kind of talking about? So those are the things that are sort of kind of attracting my attention at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that this year we really, the good news for me is that this year we really witnessed kind of this global realization that we had, a blind spots maybe that we were not looking at, and maybe that we were the water for the shark, to use your analogy, Prue. And I think that, all the social changes that we've been feeling, in the past year, maybe for me and Vedran, you've said that you see more and more requests of having this more like bottom-up approach, of having some leadership in the project at the very early stages of different representation of the community. And I think that I'm feeling that we're moving at last, we're moving maybe in that direction. And And I think that the good news of like all of those movements that we've seen this year, people kind of destroying the colonial past statues, like or icons in cities, and like showing that it couldn't work like this anymore, has maybe made this topic more popular. And this is something that I'm very happy about, because it seems like it created some kind of a demand in the developers, that there's now interest into maybe exploring this different way of working. And now I think that our job is to facilitate that, and to tell people it's not that complicated, and it's actually more efficient. And to your points, Julie, people will naturally come to your places afterwards. They will have those markers. And I think that the challenge now is really about how can we make this happen in a way that will benefit everyone and will not be that challenging. Because I think that for someone that's arriving in that wants to integrate diversity and inclusivity into their process, it may seem like something that's quite complex.
Yeah, I mean, the one way I think about it sometimes is that you want to take the end user or the person you're designing for along for the journey, right? So to engage them early and engage them often, and that way they become champions for the place. And I think it's a lot what we're speaking about, right? And that could be as simple as doing workshops or whatnot, or distributing a survey. But I think another important point was made of how we engage and the methods we use to engage, that we need to be flexible in this methodology as well, right? To acknowledge that certain communities might have different expectations or comfort levels to engage within these sort of co-creation processes that we're talking about, right? So we worked on some projects with elderly populations, for example, which might not be really comfortable with joining a virtual workshop. So thus we need to adjust to make sure that they're comfortable and that their voices are heard within the conversation and the discussion.
Sorry, I just want to add that it's not just so much in what I was saying in terms of consultation. It's like, so if I look at the example of Abidjabawan and our research center, it's Indigenous led, Indigenous designed, and Indigenous self-determined. So for me, it's like those aspects of, it's not just that, I need, or another example would be, there's a new project here in Winnipeg, and there were 6 architectural bids, and most of those architectural bids only briefly consulted people. 2 of them had actually had Indigenous consultants within their kind of team. And then on top of that, they all decided to determine what urban Shaban gallery would look like without any consultation or any relationship with the gallery or talking to the director of what they would actually need. So I think in terms of I think it's important to do surveys and reach out to community and have town hall meetings and all those bits and pieces. But, going back to Prue, what you said, it's like, who's the driver? Like, who's the architect? Who's the firm that we're working with? And in Winnipeg, we're really fortunate. We have a plethora of Indigenous architects and designers, which is quite incredible. And you can see that in the projects that they're doing, like it's visibly present. And then you can see the people wanting to participate and being in those physical spaces because they see themselves reflected.
Yeah, it's an important distinction you make, Dr. Negum, and a point well taken. And I wonder if perhaps maybe in the conversation here is how do we actually create these meaningful interactions and this meaningful co-creation process? Are there any strategies we can suggest? Anything from your work which you found effective? Could we kind of dig into some of these factors a little bit? And Rochelle, maybe you can kind of start us off in how we create meaningful engagement and representation.
Yeah, I think in the past, a lot of times it's been about who's been able to attend, who's been able to show up. And today we have such an incredible opportunity in front of us, and as we look at it here at Alliance, is how we're able to reach a much more diverse, more inclusive group of people that we can get in touch with that may not have been able to actually take the time off of work to be able to meet at that specific time. Maybe even be able to get daycare or childcare. And so then their voice isn't heard. And so we're looking at different ways through Qualtrics and other means in which that surveys can be pointed out to people on their phone. They can be reached out through different social media. It can also be through a dot matrix system where they're able to visually vote or give their opinion on things, that it doesn't necessarily have to be that you have to type or that you have to have a special app on your phone. We know that technology becomes a huge hindrance. Just even to join a Zoom meeting can be a problem for many people. And that can be half battle. And so if we're able to reach people in multiple ways, you know, through town halls, through Zoom, where we're able to gather input that way, through doing online surveys that don't really take that much time, that take a very short period of time, but reaching again out to people in multiple different ways. And then also just making sure that we're reaching out to a broader demographic, but also is like utilizing potentially some of these storefronts where it's like where people can accidentally stumble upon how to give their opinion. And that is really important. Could we utilize these storefronts to advertise for people to be able to, you know, answer or engage in the community in different ways, so that it isn't only if you have a phone, and it's not only if you've received the information. There's different ways that you're able to get it within your community to get involved.
You know, I think it's been really interesting in the last maybe 10, 15 years that there's been sort of an explosion of really interesting tactics in placemaking and creative placemaking, and Philip is, you know, brilliantly placed to talk about the incredible role that artists can play in acting as a sort of translator and intermediary between people and places in a way. So I think there's a lot of richness there. I was beginning to wonder this morning as I was thinking about this, what a charter or a set of standards for what we should expect from decent community engagement in this space might look like. And, you know, designing engagement processes that are actually tailored to the specifics of a particular community, you know, seems like a pretty good, obvious placemaking starting point, as does intentionally designing to surface and elevate typically excluded voices in that process, as you and Julie have just been saying. In residential communities, you know, especially, you know, putting that process of engagement at the beginning of the processes, again, as Julie has said. So how do we start by working in community to understand, build shared vision, explore what the models for moving a project forward might be together? Seems like a good idea. What are the sort of iterative and sustained practices that we need? So part of that is that, you know, sort of design thinking piece about, you know, prototyping and testing and returning back to the community iteratively. Part of it, it's about how you just create sustained and Rochelle, to your point, visible and accessible points of engagement throughout what can often be a really sort of tortuous and long process. You know, investing in local talent, investing in the local economy, drawing on local expertise. You know, Daniel's corporation is brilliant at doing that, I think, Gila, and you might say some more about that. I personally would say, as someone who is not a designer but spends a lot of time as an intermediary and a facilitator, that I think we spend a lot of time thinking about broad but shallow engagement, so surveys, quantitative, and not enough time thinking about deep and specific engagement with the individuals who can really help us and whose lived experience can really inform the work we do. And I would like to see much, much more of that work. And then those questions about how we plan for community-led leadership in our public spaces and places, and how do we resource that once our work is done, so that all the aspirations that communities have, which are actually to do with what it's going to be like when it's finished, what's that experience going to be like, how is it going to be activated, how do we actually plan to resource that? And too often we see beautiful renderings of new public spaces which have, you know, a concert going on in one corner, and a fantastic market going on in another corner, and all manner of lovely things happening, and absolutely no idea how any of that will be supported financially or in other ways.
I'm
Well,
going
just
to
want back
jump
there.
in.
Please, Hila. Yeah.
Sorry,
I was
Vidran,
gonna
just
ask you-
for
Yeah, go for it. Of
thank
course.
you. Thank you, Prue, for the shout out and recognition. Great to hear that, and that it's sort of hopefully becoming an industry norm, and that leading by example. I think when we talk about engagement for inclusion, we've focused a bit on the external engagement, and Prue, you mentioned it in your initial comments, and then again, but recognizing who our teams are. So are we, what is our focus on, diversity and inclusion hiring so that our teams actually reflect the communities in which we're building and designing for. And Julie mentioned it as well, our internal teams, but also our consultant teams. Are we being, again, that word intentional about who we're hiring for projects and what expertise and experience they're bringing to the table? And what we're recognizing is when we do sort of go out into community and hire, that then helps inform our engagement processes, because we might have one idea about how best to engage the community, but someone from that community really knows sort of how to get in there, actually in many cases has the trust and relationships to have some of those, really deep and meaningful conversations, the specific ones you were mentioning, Prue, and that's been really key to us. And then it's, what is the return to that community? Often it's consultation, and then what's the report back? Does that feedback actually get incorporated? And then how is the community part of that process? So we talked about that stewardship and that governance, but what are then the opportunities for inclusive economic development? So when we are putting these placemaking or design interventions in place, are we then actually awarding those contracts to artists and designers and folks from the community to benefit from that opportunity?
And I'll just kind of add in a little bit more here, is that one of the things that I didn't mention earlier is that, and as you guys, as both Prue and Gila were talking about, what really struck up to me was that, and we do this, is that as you're formulating all of this information that you're gathering, is it really needs to come from like the side of empathy, of really understanding who you want to get this information from. What is their life like? What's it like to be in their shoes? And what are their experiences? And kind of thinking about what are those influences that they've had in their lives that have them think about that space differently or want to engage in it. And how and where how do these spaces bring people to feel safe and secure so that they can express their whole self and be their whole self in the questionnaires, in being able to express themselves over what they want, but also what that space placemaking really brings them to be, so that it's a place where they want to keep coming back to, right? It's a place that means something to them. It's something that they share with their family and friends, with their community. And I think those are really important aspects as we think about creating these spaces and thinking about inclusivity. Because if I think about only myself or my friends, that my little bubble, it doesn't go very far. That's not inclusive, right? You have to really put yourself in those other shoes and get into where they're at. And that's where you're really going to get to the heart of where you want to be.
I think this notion is super interesting, and it's what I think is a positive change. In for example, in massive art, we've seen the notion of curators really evolving. Like from something that was like, oh, I have the knowledge, what I should be selecting that is interesting in terms of art piece for a public place, for example, we've seen that it's now shifting to what makes sense for the community, what makes sense for the collective. And it's like now the notion, I think it's the skills that are more, and more useful is not necessarily to have like those, really more academic maybe views on what is art or, what is culture and what we should select, but this capacity, to your point, to understand and listen to the others and to be sensitive to what's going on into the communities that are going to live in the spaces that we're designing and creating. And that's why I think art and culture are such incredible vehicles, because most of the artists are very sensitive to to social changes, to their communities, to a lot of issues that are running in our societies, and therefore they have this capacities like they have this professional capacity of listening and sensing what is going on in a community and in a society, and it's been one of their roles since thousands of years. So I think that their relevance is not only into beautifying a space, which is more of the traditional way of we would see including art or a culture to a space, but also now being included in the process at the very early stage, like Julie, you were mentioning, and being able to voice out maybe the concerns that they can sense. And yeah, I do believe that it's interesting, the shift of this powerful curators on top of a mountain versus maybe something that is more like now bottom up. And now it's a challenge, because when you're in a big, planning of a huge district or a new city of a new whole neighborhood, obviously it's really difficult to come into that bottom up approach of like more spontaneous and more like community driven. So I think that these are, the challenges that we're facing, because normally redeveloping a city or designing a plaza, it's not that that spontaneous. It's a very planned process. So I'm curious to know, maybe like Julie, you seem to have like a bit of experience. I'm curious to know how it actually, maybe some cases where it happened and that was successful, and I think people out there that they're curious to know how I can actually achieve it.
Sure. I think that there was one thing I want to go back to what Prue had said about the standards of placemaking and like those kind of like local conversations and then broader conversations. So one of the questions I wanted to pose was, who's designing those matrix standards and surveys and all the tools that we use in order to extract all that data? Because to me already that's like faulted, right? So we're, the way that we want to extract data, depending on the methodology that we use, all of a sudden gives us a bias that we don't even know yet that already is happening as we get that information filtered to us. So I think I just want to kind of pose that. I know all of you guys will smile and agree with that. So it's just to kind of put that as a side note. And I think some projects that have done, really well, if I think about the example of, we've done some big projects here in Winnipeg, where we've done some projects with the Forks Corporation. And so all those projects are led by us and for us. So I think that, and I know that sounds like a really simplistic way of saying things, but I've been involved in different projects where, there's more and more happening where, for artists, we're working directly with other architectural design firms or landscape architectural design firms. And, when we first went into that space, maybe 4 years ago, they were like, oh, you just tell us what the art's going to be and we're going to do the rest of the things. And I was like, no, you have 5 really strong folks in this space. And I was told that we were actually going to be part of the process. So if we're going to be part of the process, I'm here to advocate that we have ideas about how the landscape architecture should actually look from our perspective and point of view, not just make the pretty piece of art that you decide plunks gets here, or goes there. And I think that that's such a really good example of, and now that firm has been really invested in hiring more consultants to do that work because they saw how successful it was and how people rallied for that space and how people are gathering in that space. So I think that, those kind of pushing those kind of ideas of expertise, So, obviously the landscape architect sees themselves as the expert, but there's also, when you bring elders and other folks into the room with lots of lived experience, they're also experts in their own field and their own knowledge and their own community. So those two kind of synergies, maybe they can't do the 3D renderings, but they can definitely describe what they think it should be done. And then the folks there that have some of those skills, and it's a really nice collaboration. And I think that, that's a really good example of that happening. There's another really great example. We've been working at the Winnipeg Art Gallery for the new Inuit Art Center, which we named Hamiyuk. And so, which means it is light, it is bright, it is lit. And so we named 14 other different spaces in all 7 Indigenous languages across the province. And so in doing that, they're opening the inaugural exhibition at the Winnipeg Art Gallery. They have the first ever 4 Inuit curatorial team that represents each region of Inuit and Unanga. Most people would just go, oh, it's the North, but in fact, it's very distinctive, specific spaces with their own localized knowledge and history. And so then they worked with, they got a Inuit architect, an Inuit graphic designer, we've got Inuit educator, there's somebody else I'm forgetting. So it's like, this entire way of thinking is being shifted because we're actually utilizing the expertise of people with the cultural knowledge and the expertise knowledge, whatever you want to call it, the academic realm of the letters, whatever. But I just think at the end of the day, those have really nice synergies. And I think that even with, outside of cultural norms, firms have to start to learn how to work with artists better. There's a reason why people are drawn to those kind of rogue projects or graffiti and things that are kind of happening organically in spaces, because they're driven, just what you said, from the ground up, and people are attracted to that. And I think that, if they start seeing the artist as a peer, as opposed to just the person you plunk in the room to show you the shiny thing that they're going to make, when in fact, it can be a lot more reciprocal. And I think from my own methodologies, it's about, listening, embodied knowledge, learning by doing, making sure there's a reciprocal relationship. And just how, Rochelle, you had even said, what's the end result? What does the community get out of it? Where do they see themselves sitting? Why is that important? And I think that aftermath thing is something that I don't think that we do a good job of in general in almost all fields. I think that we get really excited about the project and we get it to fruition and it feels really good and people are happy. And then I just move on to the next thing. So it's just it's not uncommon. And sometimes, where we live, I see some of those effects more here because, I'm from here and my family's here. So I see some of those long-term pieces where there's been projects I've been involved in, globally or in Toronto, where you see, all of a sudden that space is already transformed again. So I think that output and the kind of returning to, what did the community get out of it, I think is so integral. And especially when we look at projects like Regent Park or any other kind of vulnerable, same with York University, that entire area, there's been really set projects where we could really revisit what that meant,
Yeah, I feel like it's a lot about listening, like regardless of how much expertise you have to listen with so much curiosity and and really understanding where your unconscious biases are so that you can put those to the side and really being aware of where and how you are listening with that curiosity. I think we did a project with Excel Energy, and it was a big community-led art piece that we curated there. And at first, there was a lot of different stakeholders, like maybe 30 or more, that needed to be involved in this project. And it was through the inclusive process of getting people to share their information, to share what their dreams and their aspirations were, that it actually turned into one of a really positive outcome for the community, in which that everybody felt very solid and very proud of the work that came out of it. And so therefore, just like you were saying, Julie, it's like now it lives beyond the project. It lives way beyond it. And it's a point of places where people know they knew that they were part of, and it hit so many different people. But the process took a while. But it actually made the project so much stronger than if it would have been done in a different way.
And with this question of outcomes, I was wondering, Gila, could you give us a little bit more insight in regards to the Region Park project and what those outcomes were and how that was achieved through the process?
Yeah, I'll give one sort of specific example that sort of points to what Julie was saying, which is, you know, almost the notion that once the project's done, you know, if it's been inclusive, like thumbs up, we've achieved the goal. And usually that's actually when the work needs to start as opposed to end. Daniel's Spectrum, which is the Arts and Cultural Center in Regent Park, was really one of the foundational pieces of the revitalization, because it was actually called for by residents in the social development plan for the neighborhood. It didn't make it into the first iteration of the zoning bylaw, but eventually with community collaboration and with the city, we got there. And then there was a huge amount of sort of community engagement and artist engagement that actually went into the design and the creation of the space to make sure that it was inclusive, that it met the needs of the community groups that were going to be in that space. And frankly, that the design reflected that. And I've got to do a big shout out here to Entro because the sort of exterior design was quite remarkable, where Entro analyzed the flags of all the countries in the world and then took the prominent colors. And that's actually really, the signage band that goes around Spectrum, and the color detail comes from that to, from the outside, really demonstrate a sense of welcoming and inclusion, except all of a sudden this beautiful center is built in 2012 and opens, and the existing community wasn't using it. They wouldn't even go inside. And what was remarkable about that was so much work had been done around, designing in an inclusive way. But all of a sudden, this new, shiny new building that's built as part of the revitalization next door to a condo building wasn't immediately welcoming. And that's where sort of programming and outreach became so important. And, credit to sort of the facility manager and our operator, Artscape. The Artscape team had hired locally from the community, and that's what really made the difference, where the team was able to say, okay, these are the sort of programming interventions that we can put in place. Let's open the doors and have a local sewing group in the lobby, and let's have open mic nights by the young people. And slowly that started to bring the community in and have them identify with the space and feel welcome and feel safe. All of those pieces we've talked about. But really the bricks and mortar and the design didn't do that. And that work started afterwards. So one of the biggest, things I say in a lot of these discussions is we've learned that it's not build it and they will come. It's sort of build it, program it, outreach, market it, and eventually people will start to come in. But if we can design that early on, where people feel like they have sort of a stake in the project from the beginning, that transition probably will happen much more naturally.
Can I just add to that? Because I feel like, I carry some scars on projects like that, as well as, an awful lot of pride. That, resource that, and, think, really plan for that. Running an arts and cultural centre does not come free or cheap. What are the sustained plans that we need to make to support that work that you're describing in the long term? That can't become the responsibility solely, surely, of the individual and not-for-profit sector. That's just a reality. And I, especially for those of us whose work sort of locates more in that space, when we understand what the huge huge kind of gift and value that can be bought through that work is, but what the realities of delivering it are. Plan for that future, and plan for community governance of that future as well. Is what I would add, absolutely.
I think your example is so interesting, Gila, and I mean, to connect with what Julie was saying, it's like designed by us and then used by us. I think, you know, I wonder what the people that are now using the open mic nights, how they would have designed the center. You know, this is like super interesting actually and I, you know, I think that this is a really brilliant example of, you know, how design and architecture is a canvas, you know, for the life, and maybe that's also kind of a vision that's shifting, where before, and I've had a lot of discussion with architects, you know, that we're like, oh, we were putting all the efforts in this beautiful, you know, building, and we've realized after, we're so sad because no one was going, and now we're like, oh, we have to kind of take our ego away, and like, maybe it's not about creating such a beautiful, like shiny, like aesthetically, you know, amazing place, but creating something that will truly make an interesting place for stories and connection and life, and where people will have their first kiss and their, you know, and I think that this is all this really exciting change that is happening, I think, and it's difficult because obviously everyone feels like designing a tremendously, you know, a beautiful space, obviously, but this, for me, this example is really interesting on this notion of like, it's just the start, it's just the canvas, and that's where I think, again, for me. And I really liked this idea, Julie, that you said that, you know, we have to change the perception of artists being people that are able to create like an aesthetic object, you know, that goes here or there, you know. And I think that this notion of programming, you know, you've mentioned in culture, you've mentioned open mics and, you know, like sewing classes. And I think that there's so much that culture can bring into actually creating those stories and bringing those, you know, attractive elements. And this is where I think that the shift is happening, and that I'm happy about. And Pooh, you were mentioning the challenge, the financial challenge of, you know, and I come from a region in Quebec where the government finances a lot the culture. So it's kind of a global understanding that if there's culture, it's going to be paid eventually by someone else than the private sector. So now, you know, we've been really fighting to mention to developers that not only it's the right thing to do now to get, you know, culture in their mix in order to have a more successful place, but it also makes financial sense in the end, you know, for them in the long run. And I think that's where you know, part of my challenge that I'm feeling right now is like, yeah, everyone is like super, you know, yes, let's have more inclusivity, and but in the end, you know, there's always kind of a mean CFO that's going to be like, doesn't make sense, and at the end of my Excel grid, you know, and then it has to make sense. So I've been really like kind of like, oh, how can we achieve that? You know, how can we get a mean CFO on board with our plan? You know, and so we've been trying to. We're actually working with Entro and the Ryerson University on a study that will, you know, try to create new measurements. You know, my dream is that, you know, like on an accounting software, you can export the social impact in a number or an indicator that like a CFO could look at and be like, oh, perfect, this makes total sense, check mark. And we're trying to find, and obviously it's a very complicated things to do, but luckily we're supported by a bunch of scientists as like Vedran to do that. But we're trying to find of how can we measure this impact, you know, and try to for big investment company to really quickly in a glance say, yes, you know, this makes sense. This is going to contribute to you know, my value creation, and my investor back there will be also happy. So I think it's this whole, you know, for me, it's a very important part of the challenge, you know, because I think they all agree that it's brilliant and it's a good idea, but that's, you know, part of the big challenge.
I believe we share the same dream. is how do we actually demonstrate the value and often value in dollars and cents terms, because that's what some of our stakeholders require. And I think that recognition that there are multiple stakeholders in these processes, and we have CFOs and investors and business partners that need to see the quote unquote value of these interventions.
Yeah, that's been tough. I don't know if anyone has examples where it's been successful, or you know, like where me and CFO was on board with their project, but I'm really curious to learn to hear about that.
Just to be mindful of time, I see that we have 10 minutes left, or even less now. So although Philip, as Gila said, I also share that dream, and you know, on this project we're working on, we'll hopefully come up with something useful and valuable as we work towards it. But I would like to just shift a little bit to some of our audience questions to make sure we can address some of the things that have come at us through SurveyMonkey. So the first question actually deals with one thing that we haven't really mentioned today, but it's obviously the purple elephant in the room, which is COVID. So the first question is whether COVID in the current kind of global situation presents us with new opportunities to rethink public spaces and inclusivity.
I'm like, no, because we're not allowed to go in public space. I was just like, so
All right,
no,
so
it's
there you
actually
go.
forced us. Like if for Nuit Blanche, like for me, it's like, that's our entire thing. And this year is our year of public art. And I was going to say the city of Toronto does a really good job if you want to look at some of those numbers around statisticals around, you know, the kind of impact of culture. Sarah Diamond's done a lot of work in that area, and same with the city of Toronto. Anyways, a side note, but I mean, the reality is we can't go into public space. So I feel like the answer to me is no. You know, it's in fact kind of destroyed some of those opportunities. You know, it doesn't mean that we can't think critically about how we want to go back into public space, but I feel like, you know, if anything, it's pushed all of us to have more digital literacy. It's pushed us to work more in the virtual realm. And as a person who makes digital media art, I'm happy about that. But I do think that, you know, I miss public space 100%.
All right, you've thrown down the gauntlet, Dr. Negum. Anybody else want to take the opposite stance, please?
So I kind of completely hear that, and we're all, you know, it's January, and I think this has been a tough month and a tough week for a lot of people. I mean, completely hear that. I think one of the things I notice is that because we are all sort of bound by our neighborhood boundaries, perhaps in ways that we have not been before, that we are probably paying way more attention to the communities or the neighborhoods, the sort of geographic boundaries of where we live. We're not leaving them to go to, well, many of us, those of us who are privileged enough to be able to work from home, are not leaving them every day to go somewhere else to work. We're, you know, sticking to, you know, walking for our daily regulated exercise, you know, from our front doors often. And I think that that's actually quite powerful, that, you know, people are paying much more attention to the little kind of nuances and quirks and details of where they live, and sort of embedded in that attention is a lot of the things that we sort of actually in this practice sort of want to draw out. So I don't think it's all negative, but it's certainly super frustrating.
I would totally agree with Prue. I think I've never seen Montreal City as amazing to live in than this past summer with COVID, in the sense that, okay, we needed more terrace outside. We couldn't get our inside. So suddenly the permits for terrace went crazy, and there was terrace everywhere. And okay, we need more space to circulate. So they closed down a lot of the street, although they were closing already a lot of streets, but it's never been that much pedestrian and that much bike friendly Montreal. It was like, and then there was like of course, like cars a little bit complaining, but for most of the residents, it was a dream city. I mean, they started closing down streets, putting plants, putting picnic tables so that we could, you know, gather in front of the pizza shop instead of like going back with our pizza at our place. And then I actually met a lot of my neighbors that I had never met before because we were sharing this pizza. And I mean, for me, it has actually transformed Montreal for a way better. it was really interesting. And I mean, obviously, then we all shut down again, and then it's pretty much what you're describing, Julie, that we can't go in those spaces anymore, and then the cold added this extra layer. But actually, you know, we've had this design call by the city of Montreal to, okay, well, how benefiting from this super cool city that we could build in the summer, how can we take that to our Nordic conditions? And I think that was a really interesting. We had the chance in working with you know, a collective of architects and artists on one winter station, they're called, which is, you know, creating those space for community to gather despite the minus 30 and the 30 centimeters of snow that we sometimes get. And it's been really amazing, you know, and I completely agree that that's gotten the neighborhood closer, you know, because so that's for me also on a positive note, what maybe some impact.
I'll just add one thing to it, is that I'm going to go to more of the process side of it, is that I think that COVID has shifted us all to be able to reach to people in much more different ways. And I think that will change the process overall and how we're able to include and reach out to many more people than maybe we have from previous practices or methodologies of how we've gathered that information, or just even included and had different discussions with people.
Yeah, it's a good point in the sense that it's forced us to kind of rethink how we interact with one another, with clients and end users and so on. And perhaps these new patterns of working and engaging will continue to live on post-COVID, if post-COVID ever becomes a thing, and hopefully it does. Gila, any thoughts about COVID and how it's shaping how you approach your work at Daniels?
Yeah, I think what we're really looking at right now is our public realm design. So, you know, understanding that, you know, if folks are in their community more, but their community no longer, you know, in our case means being in amenity spaces or being in arts and cultural centers or retail spaces. How do you design the public realm better? So we've been looking at that and, you know, to a point that was made earlier, not just in terms of landscape architecture, but even in the public realm, what are those placemaking interventions? What are the, you know, subtle paving patterns that reflect the local community or have local community stories? So if people are going into the for a walk, they're reading about, you know, heroes of the neighborhood in the tree grates or in the paving patterns or pieces like that. What are the urban agriculture opportunities that are providing not just beautification, but some source of food security as well. So really looking at how we sort of step up all of our efforts in terms of sort of outdoor and public realm design.
Yeah, some really wonderful examples there. Thank you, Gila. All right, I see we're getting close to the end of our time. Would anybody have anything, like to add anything else in regards to our discussion of inclusivity? I know we've covered quite a bit today. Any final comments anybody would like to add? Okay. So on that note, I'm just going to thank everybody for joining us. I think we've had a really wonderful discussion, and I feel like we'd almost issued a challenge to designers in how we think about our work, right? I think we've used this analogy of just checking boxes, and that's no longer going to fly. So I think it's really asking a lot of us to change how we work, and I'm up for the challenge, and I'm sure everybody else on the call is, and listening also is. So we'll see where this takes us. For our viewers, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate you being part of this discussion. If you have any additional questions or comments or want to continue the conversation, please feel free to reach out. And panelists, thank you again so much for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having
Thanks,
us.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.